I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always a happily ever after.
Long ago, and far away in the east, there stood an ancient city. Here, in a majestic palace, lived a king. One of the king's attendants was a young man called Yashovarman. He was very kind and loyal, and served the king most faithfully. He worked from dawn to dusk, running errands, doing everything he was told. Nothing was too much trouble for him, and never once did he complain, for he knew how great an honor it was to be allowed to serve the king. Now the king was a proud and clever man, and he liked his young attendant, and he certainly could never complain about his work. But like many very rich men, the king, who could be generous when he felt like it, had no idea what it was like to be poor. Yashovarman had no money of his own, and whenever he asked the king for some money to live on, the king would always refuse. This would make the young man very sad, for he worked very hard, and yet he had to beg food from the palace cook and clothes from the royal seamstress. It didn't matter how many times he asked the king's answer was always the same. He would point to the sun and say, "I cannot give you anything. The worshipful God forbids it." So poor Yashovarman just had to do without. Until one day, there was an eclipse of the sun. When the young man saw the eclipse, it gave him an idea. He was so poor and miserable, anything was worth a try. So he hurried away to where the king was busily giving gifts to a number of worthy subjects, and pointing to the sun, he cried, "Look, master, the worshipful god is being swallowed by his enemy. Now you can give me something." The king was so amused at this cleverness that he laughed greatly and tossed him a beautiful robe and a bag full of gold. Yashovarman was overjoyed by his change of fortune. At last the king had given him something. But after a few months, he found to his great sorrow that all the gold was gone. He was just as poor as he had been before the eclipse. What was he to do? He did so wish he could have a little money each month. He had no wish to go back to living on scraps. The next day, after the king had finished his lunch, the young man came before him and, bowing, asked very politely if he might have a few coins. But the king just shook his finger and, pointing to the sun, said, "But you know the worshipful god forbids it." Poor Yashovarman was very upset. It was no use. The king was not going to give him anything. The young man grew more and more miserable, for he knew he would have to wait years before there was another eclipse. Even if there was, the king might not give him anything. So one day, when he could stand it no longer, he decided he would go and visit the shrine of the goddess in the forest beyond the city. As he walked through the green, peaceful glades, he thought very seriously to himself, "I cannot go on living like this. If things get no better and the goddess does not smile on me, then I shall give up my life before her." And he walked on through the silent forest until he came at last to the goddess's shrine. He bowed reverently and gave a flower in offering, for he had nothing else to give. He would spend the day here, fasting and praying, and perhaps if the goddess was pleased with him, she might appear. So he sat down on the grass facing the shrine. Closing his eyes, he concentrated his thoughts and remained many hours there in contemplation. Suddenly, someone whispered his name very softly. He waited, and the goddess appeared to him. He was overcome that she should appear to someone as insignificant as he. Then the goddess spoke in a low voice. "You have pleased me, Yashovarman, and in reward I shall give you either the gift of riches or the gift of happiness. You may choose which." The young man was puzzled. "But dear goddess, what is the difference? Are not riches and happiness one and the same thing?" The goddess smiled and said, "If you do not know the difference, then return to the city and visit there 2 merchants, one rich and one happy. They will help you decide, and when you have, return here to me." With the goddess's words ringing in his ears, he felt cheered and hopeful. The next day, following the goddess's advice, he set out for the house of the rich and prosperous merchant. As he walked up to the door, he felt quite excited. Perhaps at last his fortunes would change. The servant opened the door. The rich merchant greeted his guest most courteously and invited him to stay and dine. The young man was very impressed as he looked round the room. For though he had worked in the palace and seen many beautiful things, this merchant wasn't a king, and yet he had many precious objects which were greatly admired. Yes, this merchant was very rich indeed. Food was called for, and the young man felt immediately at ease. It was so pleasant to be offered things without having to beg or plead. The 2 men chatted together as the servant brought in the scented cloths for them to wash their hands. Then the food was served. Bowls of rice and curry were brought in. Oh, they smelt delicious. What a change this was from eating scraps from the royal table. He helped himself generously to the food, and then when he saw the merchant had no curry, he offered him some. But he only took a spoonful. The young man ate with great enjoyment. But the rich merchant ate little. He seemed to be in pain. "Why did you take so little curry?" he asked. "What's the matter?" "Today, in your honor, I have eaten some curry," explained the merchant. "But when I'm alone, I eat only barley and ghee, for I have a very weak stomach." The young man decided that his host certainly didn't look very healthy. His complexion was blotchy, and he obviously had bad digestion. Yashovarman continued to eat, and thought to himself, "Riches do not seem to bring him great joy." After the meal, it was time for the 2 men to retire. The merchant showed his guests to the sleeping quarters. Yashovarman had eaten so well that he was now feeling very content and sleepy and looking forward to a good night's rest. His host offered his guest a bed, and the young man went thankfully over to it and settled himself down. As he lay there, he thought sleepily that for all his riches, the merchant didn't seem very happy. Though riches were certainly not to be dismissed, for it was wonderful to live in such a magnificent house and have everything you desired. With these thoughts, he nodded off to sleep. Suddenly, he had a terrible dream. 3 men appeared and began beating the rich merchant on the stomach with sticks. One cried out, "You wretch! Why did you eat that curry? You know you're not allowed to!" And the rich merchant cried out in pain. The young man started awake and quickly looked over and saw the rich merchant was indeed in great pain. He was writhing on his bed in agony, while 3 servants massaged his stomach to ease his discomfort. As the rich merchant's groans died down a little, Yashovarman thought to himself, "If this is what riches bring, I want none of it. Where is the happiness here?" Then he fell back to sleep. The next morning, Yashovarman took his leave of the rich merchant and thanked him kindly for his generous hospitality. But somehow he couldn't get the terrible dream out of his mind, and he went off feeling rather despondent. He made his way to the house of the happy merchant, and when he arrived there, he saw that although the house was not very grand, it was pleasant. A servant opened the door and ushered him in. Yashovarman presented himself to the merchant, who courteously invited him to be a guest in his house. As the young man looked round the room, he saw that although there was little of the gold and silver he'd seen in the other house, the room was pleasantly decorated, and his host seemed most courteous. Just then, a weaver came in with some cloth he'd woven. He wanted the merchant to sell it for him. It was excellent quality. Then a buyer arrived. "Good day," said the merchant. "Here is some fine cloth you might like." The merchant and the weaver waited eagerly for the buyer's opinion. Yes, it's good cloth," said the buyer. "How much?" The merchant wanted 10 rupees. This was far too much for the buyer, and he offered 5. 8 rupees was the merchant's last offer. The weaver was very happy with 5 rupees, but he dared not say anything. The buyer wanted the cloth, so he agreed to 8. The merchant was delighted, for he'd done a good deal for both himself and the weaver. Yashovarman was very impressed. How clever this merchant was, and how much he enjoyed his work. The buyer departed with the cloth. The merchant counted out the money. He paid the weaver the price they had agreed and kept his commission. A servant brought some refreshment. The merchant gave the servant the money he had made and told him to give it to his wife so she might buy food for their guest's dinner. Yashovarman found the merchant such pleasant company and did enjoy being his guest. As the two sat chatting, who should appear but a neighbour? He had come to invite the merchant to a party he was giving. All their friends were going to be there. The merchant should leave his work immediately and come and join them. The merchant thanked his friend, but said he could not attend the party, for he had a guest for dinner. But this was no problem. Bring your guest with you to the party. Yashovarman was very moved. What nice neighbours the merchant had. How generous it was for him to be invited to the party. So they made their way to the friend's house and joined in the festivities. After a delicious meal, where they were served many delicacies, the men sat and watched some fine dancing. As the young man watched, his thoughts turned to how miserable he had felt but a few days before. He could not believe how much better he felt. This merchant had such a pleasant life, with good friends, a job he enjoyed, and a fine house. But what was most important was that he seemed so happy with his life. Unlike the rich merchant, who for all his possessions was made miserable by ill health and seemed to enjoy little happiness. The dancer was so graceful and pleasant to watch that all the guests felt very peaceful and relaxed. It was such a pleasant way to spend an evening after a hot, tiring day's work here in the company of friends. Yashovarman knew none of these people, but they had all made him feel very welcome and at home. In the warm, scented night air, he felt happy and at peace. Tomorrow he would return to the goddess. He must have his answer ready for her. Now, although he'd thought very seriously about the choice between riches or happiness, and he was almost sure about which one he wanted, he hadn't quite made up his mind. At last, the party came to an end, and it was time for the guests to leave. They returned to their house, and there they ate a delicious meal cooked by the host's wife. As they ate, they talked, and the happy merchant told stories of his earlier life. The servant brought in more dishes of food and placed them beside the men. They were beginning to feel quite full after all this delicious fare. The merchant then handed the pitcher to the servant, saying that he hoped there was something for his guest to drink. But the servant said, "There is no more to drink, master." The merchant did not like to think of his guest going thirsty in the night. But Yashovarman did not feel at all thirsty. Indeed, he was feeling very sleepy and began to yawn. The merchant, seeing this, decided it was time for bed. So he showed his guest to a bed on the other side of the room. The merchant fell sound asleep immediately. It had been a very busy day for him. Yashovarman thought for a moment what a wonderful day it had been, and what a kind and generous host this merchant was. Soon he was asleep too, and it wasn't long before he began to have another strange dream. He saw 3 men enter the room. One was the servant, who looked very ashamed. The other 2 men with sticks were shouting, "Why was there nothing to drink tonight, wretch?" The servant begged forgiveness. The young man awoke, but the room was empty, save for the merchant, who lay on his bed, peacefully asleep. Yashovarman smiled as he thought to himself, "If you are blessed with happiness, it can bring only enjoyment and well-being. Then he turned over and went happily back to sleep. The next morning, he said goodbye to his host and thanked him for his kind hospitality. They agreed to meet again, for their day together had been so pleasant. The happy merchant watched the young man depart, and he wished him every happiness in his heart. Yashovarman hurried out of the city and through the forest to the goddess's shrine. He paid homage and then settled down to wait. He meditated for some time, until at last the goddess appeared and said softly, "Well, my son, have you decided?" "Oh, yes, I choose happiness, for I found little enjoyment in riches." "You have chosen wisely, my son," said the goddess, "and I shall indeed grant you the happiness you desire." Yashovarman then felt a feeling of great peace and warmth come over him. He returned to the city, and thanks to the goddess, he had just enough of everything to make him happy: good friends, a nice house, a good job, and enough to eat. And whenever Yashovarman saw a rich man, he never envied him his gold or jewels, for he knew that happiness brings far more pleasure and enjoyment than riches could ever buy.